At my sister's retirement party, she called me useless. That was the first sentence of the evening, spoken lightly into a crystal microphone as if it were a harmless joke, as if the word itself didn't carry weight. The guests laughed on cue. The string quartet kept playing. I kept smiling. Diane stood at the center of her living room, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the golf course she and her husband had moved to 5 years ago. At 72, she wore a navy dress tailored perfectly at the waist, her silver hair styled in careful waves. A banner behind her read "Congratulations on 35 years, and the catering staff moved through the crowd with trays of sparkling wine and crab cakes. I had driven 45 miles to be there, my sensible heels pinching by the time I reached the marble entryway. I brought a handwritten card. I always bring handwritten cards. Oh, Margaret, Diane continued, touching my arm with a laugh, she's always been the dependent one in the family. But we love her anyway. More laughter. A few polite nods. Someone clinked a glass. I adjusted the cuff of my cream blazer and nodded as though I agreed. I have learned that silence unsettles people more than protest ever could. The room smelled of peonies and expensive perfume. Brandon, her son, hovered near the bar in a tailored gray suit, shaking hands with colleagues from the firm where he'd just made senior manager. He didn't look at me. He rarely does in rooms where success is being measured. Diane has always liked an audience. Even when we were children growing up in a modest ranch house in Ohio, she preferred applause to privacy. I preferred ledgers and long evenings balancing accounts at the kitchen table. After our father passed, it was my bookkeeping job that kept the mortgage paid. After Diane's first business venture failed in her 30s, it was my savings that covered the overdue property taxes. I never announced those things. I simply wrote the checks and mailed them. At the party, Diane lifted her champagne flute again. Some people retire after building something meaningful, she said. Others just drift. She looked at me when she said it. The laughter was softer this time, edged with curiosity. I could feel eyes turning, assessing. I smiled. I have practiced that smile in mirrors and in hospital waiting rooms and across boardroom tables where men twice my size assumed I was only there to take notes. It is a calm smile. It gives nothing away. 3 days earlier, I had received a brief phone call from Jonathan Reed. His voice was measured, respectful. He asked if I would be attending Diane's retirement celebration. I told him I would. He paused for a moment, then said he looked forward to seeing me. I didn't mention that to Diane. There are some details that reveal themselves better in their own time. Back in the living room, Diane set down her glass and leaned closer to me, her voice lowering just enough to sound intimate while still carrying across the nearest circle of guests. You should be proud of Brandon, she said. He's worked very hard. Not everyone gets handed opportunities. The implication hung in the air, subtle but sharp. I nodded again. Brandon's college tuition had once been a temporary loan. It was never repaid, and I never asked. I believed in quiet investments. The quartet shifted into a slower tune. Outside, the sun dipped behind the fairway, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I stood there, feeling neither small nor angry, only aware. Words like useless are often spoken by people who have forgotten who steadied the ladder while they climbed. I watched Diane bask in the glow of admiration, accepting congratulations as if she had built every rung alone. I checked my watch. It was 7:18 p.m. Right on time, I heard the front door open and the low murmur of a new arrival greeting the hostess. Diane's smile widened in anticipation of yet another admirer. I remained where I was, hands folded lightly in front of me, my expression unchanged. Sometimes the most important introductions are not the ones you announce. They are the ones that quietly shift the balance of a room. The conversation near the front door softened into a ripple of polite greetings, the kind reserved for someone whose presence shifts attention without effort. I did not turn immediately. I have learned that anticipation carries more weight than reaction. Diane moved first, smoothing the front of her dress as though she were adjusting the lighting in the room itself. Brandon stepped forward, shoulders squared, the eager confidence of a man who believes he is about to impress someone important. The murmur grew clearer. Jonathan Reed had arrived precisely when he said he would. His voice was steady, warm, unmistakably accustomed to boardrooms rather than living rooms. He thanked Diane for the invitation. He congratulated her on her retirement. There was applause again, this time more genuine, more measured. I could feel Diane radiating satisfaction. For years she had mentioned him in conversation, always with a slight emphasis, as though proximity to his title added shine to her own accomplishments. I kept my hands folded loosely and allowed myself to observe. The caterer refreshed glasses. Someone dimmed the overhead light slightly, giving the room a soft amber glow. It was almost theatrical, the way admiration gathered around certain people like stage lighting. Diane guided Jonathan toward the center of the room, introducing him to neighbors, to colleagues, to distant relatives who suddenly found reason to stand straighter. When Brandon extended his hand and said, "Good evening, sir," there was a subtle tremor in his voice. He had been working toward partnership for 2 years. He believed this evening mattered for his career. Jonathan responded with polite professionalism, his posture relaxed but attentive. Then his eyes moved across the room, scanning faces with quiet familiarity, until they landed on mine. Recognition does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears first in stillness. His expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough for me to see that he had found what he was looking for. He excused himself mid-conversation. Diane's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Jonathan crossed the room without haste. The sound of his footsteps against hardwood seemed louder than it should have been. I did not step forward. I did not lift my hand. I simply met his gaze. "Margaret Collins," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the music and conversation, "it has been too long." A few guests glanced between us, uncertain whether they had missed something significant. I offered a small nod. "Good to see you, Jonathan," I replied. Diane's posture tightened beside us. She laughed lightly, attempting to reclaim the center. "You two know each other?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Jonathan smiled, but not at her. "Margaret was the one who convinced me not to sell my first company when I was 30, he said. "She reviewed every contract, every projection. I would not be here without her." The room grew noticeably quieter. Compliments spoken by someone of status tend to land with more weight than the same words spoken by family. Brandon's expression shifted from polite interest to confusion. Diane's glass hovered near her lips, untouched. I adjusted the sleeve of my blazer, the fabric smooth beneath my fingers. "You always had good instincts," I said calmly. Jonathan shook his head slightly. "I had good guidance," he replied. He turned slightly, addressing the small crowd that had begun to gather. "Margaret has an eye for long-term stability. She sees risk before anyone else does." Diane attempted another laugh. "Well, she never mentioned that," she said. There was a faint edge beneath her tone. I did not respond to that. Silence can be generous. Jonathan continued, unaware or perhaps unconcerned with the tension threading through the room. He spoke about early meetings in modest conference rooms, about spreadsheets printed on inexpensive paper, about advice that favored patience over applause. He did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He simply stated facts. I watched the shift unfold gradually. The same guests who had laughed earlier now regarded me with a different expression, one that mixed curiosity with recalculation. Brandon cleared his throat. "I did not realize," he began, but he did not finish the sentence. Diane straightened her shoulders again, reclaiming composure as best she could. "Well," she said brightly, "Margaret has always been full of surprises." I met her eyes for a brief moment. There was no anger in me, only clarity. Some truths do not require defense. They reveal themselves when the room is ready to hear them. The silence that followed did not feel dramatic. It felt precise. Conversations resumed in smaller clusters, but their tone had changed, softened at the edges, as though everyone were recalibrating what they thought they understood. Jonathan remained beside me, asking about my recent work, about the advisory board meeting we had discussed earlier that week. He spoke to me as an equal, not as an afterthought. Diane stood half a step behind him, her smile fixed in place, her posture immaculate. She attempted to reinsert herself into the dialogue, mentioning Brandon's upcoming performance review, highlighting his long hours and measurable growth metrics, but Jonathan's attention returned to me each time, asking for my opinion on market shifts, on long-term strategy, on the sustainability of aggressive expansion. I answered calmly, deliberately, without flourish. There is a difference between confidence and noise. I have never needed the latter. Brandon shifted his weight from one foot to the other, absorbing details he had not expected to hear. The word useless does not survive long in rooms where facts are introduced. Diane eventually excused herself to check on the catering, though the staff had everything well under control. I watched her cross the room with steady steps, shoulders straight, chin lifted just enough to suggest composure. I did not follow. Jonathan lowered his voice slightly and said he had wanted to publicly acknowledge my early guidance for some time. I told him acknowledgment was unnecessary. Results speak well enough on their own. He smiled and replied that leadership often requires visible gratitude. I glanced around the room, noticing how several guests pretended not to be listening while clearly doing exactly that. Reputation shifts quietly, but it shifts. Brandon cleared his throat and asked about the upcoming partnership announcements. Jonathan responded thoughtfully, outlining expectations without promising anything. Then he added that mentorship remains a defining factor in advancement. His eyes moved briefly toward me again. I said nothing. Silence can also be instruction. Diane returned with a tray of sparkling water, offering glasses with practiced hospitality. She handed one to me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. I suppose I never knew the full extent of your activities, she said, her tone light but tight. I accepted the glass. There are many things we do that do not require applause, I replied evenly. She nodded, as though the exchange were harmless. It was not hostility that filled the space between us. It was recognition. The string quartet transitioned into a softer melody, and the party resumed its rhythm, though altered. Guests approached me now with polite questions about consulting, about investment strategy, about whether I still worked with emerging firms. I answered without exaggeration, careful to keep my language grounded. I have always believed that power revealed too aggressively invites resistance. Power revealed calmly invites respect. Diane drifted between groups, maintaining her gracious host persona, yet her gaze returned to me more often than before. Brandon stood nearer to Jonathan than he had earlier, listening closely, his earlier certainty replaced with concentration. I felt no desire to correct Diane publicly, no need to reference the checks written decades ago. Or the tuition payments transferred quietly every semester. The truth had already entered the room. It did not need decoration. As the evening progressed, the laughter that once circled around me now moved in measured tones, and the word dependent had disappeared from conversation entirely. I remained composed, aware that sometimes the most effective response to dismissal is not defense but demonstration. The night was not finished, but the balance had already shifted. By 8:30 the party had regained its rhythm, yet it was a different rhythm than before. Conversations carried a new caution, like guests stepping carefully across polished floors in unfamiliar shoes. Jonathan eventually excused himself to speak with a small group near the fireplace, but not before telling Diane how fortunate the company had been to benefit from long-term vision. He did not look at me when he said it. He did not need to. The implication was already settled. I moved toward the windows for a moment, watching the last of the daylight fade over the manicured fairway. The sprinklers had come on, mist rising in gentle arcs under landscape lighting. Diane approached quietly, her reflection appearing beside mine in the glass before she spoke. "You could have mentioned your involvement," she said, her tone smooth but tight around the edges. I kept my eyes on the lawn. "It did not seem necessary," I replied. She folded her arms lightly, careful not to wrinkle the fabric of her dress. "It would have helped Brandon," she added. I turned toward her then, meeting her gaze fully. "Brandon will advance because of his own discipline," I said. "Not because of borrowed credibility." The words were not harsh. They were simple. Diane held my stare for a moment longer than she intended, then released a soft laugh. "You always did enjoy being mysterious," she said. I did not correct her. Mystery is often just discretion misunderstood. Across the room, Brandon was listening intently as Jonathan outlined the expectations for senior leadership. I recognized the look on my nephew's face. It was the look of someone recalculating. Diane's voice softened slightly. "You never told me you still consulted," she said. There was a faint thread of accusation beneath the curiosity. "You never asked," I answered calmly. That was the truth. For years, our conversations had revolved around her achievements, her milestones, her carefully curated success. I had allowed that narrative to remain unchallenged. Not because it was accurate, but because correction would have served no purpose. Tonight had changed that equation without my assistance. Diane glanced around to ensure no one stood close enough to overhear. "Do you enjoy this?" she asked quietly. I considered the question. Enjoyment was not the word. "I prefer clarity," I said. Her lips pressed together briefly. The quartet shifted to a familiar classic standard, something nostalgic and elegant. Guests began gathering near the dining table where a tiered cake waited beneath soft lighting. Diane's smile returned as she prepared to make another speech, though the ease had thinned. I stepped back into the periphery, content to observe. When Diane thanked her colleagues and spoke about resilience and perseverance, her voice remained steady, yet she avoided certain phrases she might have used earlier. Words like independent and self-made did not appear this time. Instead she spoke about community, about support, about those who stand behind us. The room applauded politely. Brandon cut the cake with deliberate care. I accepted a small slice, though I rarely eat dessert after 7 in the evening. Jonathan joined me briefly once more before departing, shaking my hand with a measured nod that required no translation. "We will speak next week," he said. As planned. I confirmed that we would. Diane watched that exchange carefully. When Jonathan left, several guests followed soon after, their conversations already drifting toward other topics, yet I could sense that tonight would be recounted later in quieter settings. Reputation does not change in an instant. It adjusts gradually, like light shifting at dusk. As I prepared to leave, Diane walked me to the door. The air outside was cooler now, carrying the scent of freshly watered grass. She hesitated before speaking. "I did not mean what I said earlier," she offered, her voice lower than it had been all evening. I paused with my hand on the handle. "You meant it when you said it," I replied evenly. "But meaning something does not make it accurate." She inhaled slowly, perhaps searching for a sharper reply, but none arrived. I stepped onto the front porch, the night quiet and composed. Behind me, the house glowed warmly, still full of voices and clinking glasses. I did not feel triumphant. I felt balanced. There is a difference. Some people require applause to feel substantial. Others require only alignment between truth and perception. As I walked to my car under the soft path lights, I understood that the word useless would not follow me home. It had already dissolved in the light of simple acknowledgment. The drive home took just under an hour, long enough for the night to settle into something steady and quiet. I kept the radio off. The road stretched ahead in familiar curves, headlights tracing pale lines across the asphalt. I did not replay Diane's words. I did not rehearse clever responses I might have offered. I have never believed in arguing with echoes. When I reached my townhouse, I parked in the same space I have used for 12 years, beneath the maple tree that drops leaves into neat piles every October. Inside, the house was calm, exactly as I left it. A single lamp glowed in the living room, casting soft light across the bookshelf where binders of financial reports sat in careful order. I removed my heels and placed them side by side near the door. Small rituals restore balance. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the same oak table where I have reviewed contracts and projections for decades. The evening had not surprised me. It had clarified something that had been shifting for years. Diane has always measured value by visibility. I have measured it by stability. Around 9:15, my phone vibrated softly against the wood. Brandon's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice carried a hesitation I had not heard before. He thanked me for attending. He mentioned that he had not known about my early work with Jonathan. He said it as though he were piecing together a puzzle that had always been in front of him. I listened without interrupting. When he paused, I told him there are many chapters in a life that do not need to be announced to be real. He asked why I never told him. I answered honestly. You were building your own foundation, I said. It would not have helped you to lean on mine. There was a quiet on the other end of the line, thoughtful rather than defensive. He asked if we could have coffee sometime soon. I agreed. Not because I felt vindicated, but because conversation matters more when it is requested rather than imposed. After we ended the call, I washed the single glass in the sink and dried it carefully. The house felt neither lonely nor triumphant. It felt aligned. I moved to the small desk in the corner of the living room and opened my laptop. An email from Jonathan awaited, brief and professional, confirming the agenda for next week's advisory meeting. At the bottom he had written, "Thank you for your steady counsel." I closed the computer without replying immediately. Some acknowledgments are best received quietly. I thought of Diane standing at her doorway earlier, offering a partial apology shaped more by circumstance than reflection. I do not resent her. Resentment requires ongoing investment. I prefer detachment paired with memory. Words spoken in public can reveal more than the speaker intends. They reveal assumptions, hierarchies, insecurities. Tonight revealed something else as well. It revealed that visibility and value are not the same. I have spent years comfortable in the background, content to let outcomes speak where I did not. That choice was never weakness. It was preference. Before turning in for the night, I stepped onto the small patio behind my townhouse. The air was cool, the sky clear. In the distance, traffic hummed faintly along the highway. I rested my hands on the railing and allowed the evening to settle completely. The word useless had lost its weight hours ago. It had been replaced not by applause, but by perspective. Tomorrow would be ordinary. There would be meetings, numbers, decisions made in conference rooms without banners or quartets. That is the environment where I have always felt most at ease. Quiet rooms. Measured voices. Outcomes that do not require laughter to validate them. I turned off the patio light and went inside, closing the door gently behind me. The night required nothing more. The morning arrived without ceremony. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in narrow bands across the kitchen counter, landing on the stack of mail I had not yet opened. I rose at 6:30, as I always do, and prepared coffee the same way I have for years, measured grounds, steady pour, no distractions. Routine restores perspective faster than reflection ever could. By 7:15 I was dressed in a charcoal blazer and low heels, reviewing notes for the advisory meeting scheduled downtown at 10. The office tower where the firm operated stood 22 stories above Main Street, its glass facade reflecting the river that curved just beyond it. I have walked through those doors many times, though rarely with announcement. Influence does not require a corner office to be real. When I entered the lobby, the receptionist greeted me by name. There was no hesitation, no curiosity. Only recognition. I signed in and took the elevator to the 18th floor, the soft hum of ascent steady and familiar. The conference room was already prepared, long walnut table polished, projection screen lowered halfway, pitchers of water aligned precisely at each end. Jonathan stood near the window reviewing a set of printed charts. He looked up and offered a brief nod. "Good morning, Margaret," he said. I returned the greeting and took my usual seat midway down the table, neither at the head nor at the periphery. Placement matters. It signals intention without proclamation. As the other board members arrived, conversation remained focused and professional. Market trends. Risk exposure. Long-term capital allocation. I listened carefully before speaking, as I always have. When discussion shifted toward internal promotions, Jonathan paused slightly before addressing Brandon's candidacy. His language was measured, neither overly generous nor dismissive. "He has potential," he said, "but mentorship and consistency will determine readiness." Several eyes turned toward me briefly, not because I demanded it, but because my involvement was now visible. I did not advocate directly. I asked questions instead. How does he respond under pressure? How does he handle disagreement? Has he demonstrated independent judgment? These were not obstacles. They were standards. The meeting concluded just after 11:30. As we gathered our papers, Jonathan mentioned that he intended to formalize the advisory structure publicly next quarter. Transparency, he said, strengthens stability. I agreed. Outside the building, the air carried the crispness of early autumn. I walked 2 blocks to a small cafe where Brandon had asked to meet. He arrived promptly at noon, jacket folded over his arm, expression thoughtful. We ordered coffee and sat near the window overlooking the street. For a moment he seemed unsure where to begin. "I misjudged you," he said finally. The words were simple. I appreciated that. "You did not have all the information," I replied. He nodded. "My mother speaks often about independence," he continued, "about building something without help." I stirred my coffee slowly. "Independence is admirable," I said. "But very few people achieve it entirely alone." He looked down at his cup. "Why did you never correct her?" he asked. I considered that carefully. "Because correction offered publicly can humiliate," I answered. "And humiliation rarely builds character." He absorbed that in silence. After a moment he asked what I believed he needed to improve. I did not soften my response. I spoke about consistency, about listening before reacting, about understanding that credibility is earned gradually rather than inherited. He listened without defensiveness. That mattered. When we finished our coffee, he thanked me again, this time without hesitation. As we stood to leave, he said he would like guidance moving forward. I told him guidance is available to those willing to receive it. Walking back toward the parking garage, I felt no satisfaction in being proven right. I felt something steadier than that. Alignment between perception and reality creates space for growth, not victory. Diane had built her evening around applause. I built my days around outcomes. Both approaches carry consequence. By late afternoon, emails had begun circulating internally announcing structural updates to the advisory board. My name appeared without embellishment, listed plainly among others. There was no fanfare, no celebration. Only acknowledgment. That was sufficient. As I drove home beneath a pale sky, I understood that influence revealed is different from influence sought. One demands attention. The other commands respect. I preferred the latter. The announcement circulated internally by late afternoon, understated but precise. A brief email from executive leadership confirmed the restructuring of the advisory board and outlined the names of those formally recognized. Mine appeared in the middle of the list, neither highlighted nor minimized. That placement felt appropriate. Influence that lasts does not require decorative framing. By 5 o'clock my phone began receiving quiet responses. 2 former colleagues sent brief congratulations. One junior analyst thanked me for a recommendation I had written 3 years earlier. None of it felt dramatic. It felt like alignment catching up to fact. Around 6:30, Diane called. I watched her name illuminate the screen for a moment before answering. Her voice carried an unfamiliar restraint. She mentioned that someone from the firm had forwarded the announcement to her. She said she had not realized the extent of my involvement. I listened without interruption. There was a pause on her end, longer than usual. I suppose I underestimated you, she said. Finally. The words were not easy for her. I did not rush to soften them. It is easy to underestimate what is not displayed, I replied calmly. Silence settled again between us. In the background I could hear the faint hum of her dishwasher, the ordinary sounds of a house returning to routine after a gathering. She asked whether Brandon's meeting with me had gone well. I told her it had been productive. She exhaled slowly. He admires you, she admitted, almost reluctantly. I did not respond immediately. Admiration is not a trophy. It is responsibility. He has potential, I said. He will need discipline. Diane shifted the subject then, mentioning neighborhood updates, mutual acquaintances, surface-level topics that required no vulnerability. I allowed the conversation to drift without tension. When we ended the call, there was no apology and no confrontation. Only acknowledgment that something had changed. The following morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The hallway conversations were subtle but noticeable. A few associates who previously passed with polite indifference now offered direct greetings. Brandon approached me before the weekly strategy briefing began. He carried a folder under his arm and a seriousness in his expression. I reviewed the projections you mentioned, he said. You were right about the risk exposure. I nodded once. Adjust the timeline, I advised. Stability first. Expansion second. He thanked me and moved toward his seat. I observed the shift in his posture. It was not deference. It was awareness. Throughout the meeting, he contributed with measured confidence rather than rehearsed enthusiasm. Growth rarely announces itself loudly. It shows in calibration. By midday, Jonathan requested a brief private discussion in his office. The windows behind his desk framed the river in muted gray light. He spoke candidly about succession planning, about the importance of leadership that balances visibility with discretion. You have always understood that balance, he said. I did not accept the compliment as praise. I accepted it as confirmation. When I left his office, I felt neither elevated nor vindicated. I felt steady. Outside, autumn wind moved through the trees lining the street, scattering a few early leaves across the sidewalk. I walked to my car with the same pace I have kept for years. Reputation had adjusted, but I had not. That is the difference between performance and principle. Performance requires reinforcement. Principle sustains itself. By evening, the firm's internal newsletter had posted a brief feature introducing the updated advisory board. There was no dramatic headline, no embellished biography. Only facts. I closed the browser and shut down my computer. The room around me remained unchanged. Quiet. Orderly. Balanced. Some shifts occur in public. Others unfold in silence. This one had done both. By the end of the week, the shift had settled into something permanent rather than momentary. Recognition, once introduced, has a way of altering how rooms arrange themselves. I noticed it in small details first. Invitations to review early drafts of strategic proposals arrived in my inbox before decisions were finalized. Associates who once copied me as a courtesy now asked direct questions. Brandon requested a standing 30-minute session every Friday morning to review long-term planning models. I agreed, not out of sentiment, but because consistency creates discipline. On Friday at 8 o'clock, he arrived with a notebook instead of a tablet. That detail mattered. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he chose his words carefully. There was less eagerness to impress and more intention to understand. Growth reveals itself in restraint. During one of our sessions, he paused and said, "My mother built her confidence by proving people wrong." He hesitated before continuing. "You built yours by never needing to." I considered that quietly. "Confidence is not built," I replied. "It is remembered." He nodded slowly, as though the statement required time to settle. Later that afternoon, Diane stopped by the office unexpectedly. She had called ahead, but not to me. She said she had been in the neighborhood and wanted to congratulate Jonathan personally. When she entered the conference room where we happened to be reviewing projections, she greeted everyone with practiced warmth. Her posture remained impeccable, but there was a softness in her eyes that had not been there before. She addressed me directly this time, not as an aside, not as an accessory to the conversation. "Margaret," she said, holding my gaze evenly, I read the advisory announcement. "Congratulations." The word did not feel forced. It felt measured. I thanked her simply. No elaboration. No history revisited. Jonathan spoke briefly about upcoming initiatives, and Diane listened with attentive composure. When the discussion concluded, she lingered a moment near the doorway. "I underestimated the power of quiet work," she said softly, almost to herself. I met her eyes without triumph. "Quiet work often carries the longest reach," I answered. She gave a small nod, the kind that signals acknowledgment rather than agreement, and left without further comment. That evening, I walked along the river path near my townhouse, the air carrying the cool edge of approaching autumn. Leaves shifted underfoot, crisp but not yet brittle. I reflected not on vindication, but on calibration. Public perception had adjusted, yet I had not altered my pace, my tone, or my approach. That steadiness is what allows shifts to endure. The following Monday, an internal memo announced Brandon's provisional advancement into a leadership development track. It was not a promotion yet, but it was direction. He thanked me privately, acknowledging that the questions I had asked during earlier meetings had forced him to refine his analysis. I reminded him that refinement is continuous, not conditional. He accepted that without defensiveness. Diane called later that week, her voice calmer than it had been in years. She spoke of volunteer work she was considering, of mentoring younger women entering her former industry. There was no grand apology, no dramatic reversal. Only adjustment. "Perhaps visibility is not the only form of success," she said during that conversation. I did not rush to agree. "Success depends on sustainability," I replied. "Not volume." We spoke for nearly 20 minutes, longer than we had in a long time. The conversation did not circle back to that evening. It did not need to. Some lessons are absorbed without repetition. At the office, my advisory role continued without spectacle. Decisions were made. Strategies refined. Meetings conducted with the same calm cadence they had always carried. Yet the air in those rooms felt clearer. Titles had not changed my demeanor, nor had acknowledgment inflated it. If anything, it reinforced the value of discretion. Influence revealed too loudly becomes performance. Influence carried steadily becomes foundation. As the weeks progressed, I noticed something subtle but meaningful. Laughter in conference rooms no longer followed dismissive remarks. It followed insight. Respect had replaced amusement. Not because I demanded it, but because it had become earned beyond dispute. The balance that shifted at that party had extended into everyday reality. I did not chase it. I simply allowed it to settle where it belonged. Autumn settled fully by the time the quarter closed, the river outside the office reflecting muted gold. Beneath overcast skies. The advisory meetings had grown more efficient, less performative, more focused on substance than impression. Brandon's development track progressed steadily. He no longer rushed to fill silence in conference rooms. He allowed data to settle before speaking. That restraint earned him attention in ways enthusiasm never had. One Friday morning, after our usual review session, he closed his notebook and remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. "I used to think strength meant being seen," he said quietly. "Now I think it means being prepared." I offered a small nod. "Prepared people do not need applause," I replied. He absorbed that without argument. Diane invited me to dinner 2 weeks later. Not a party. Not a gathering. Just the two of us at her home. The house felt different without catered trays and background music. It felt lived in rather than staged. She served grilled salmon and a simple salad, no elaborate presentation. During the meal, she spoke more about the years after our father passed, about the fear she carried when her first business collapsed, about how visibility became her shield. "If they saw me as confident," she said, "they would not see how uncertain I felt." I listened without interruption. Admission changes the weight of past words. I told her that silence had been my shield, not because I lacked confidence, but because I preferred stability over spectacle. She considered that thoughtfully. "I thought you stayed quiet because you had nothing to prove," she said. Maybe I stayed loud because I felt I did. There was no accusation in her tone. Only recognition. After dinner, we cleared the dishes side by side, movements measured and unhurried. There was no need to revisit that evening months ago. It had served its purpose. At the firm, Jonathan gradually delegated more strategic oversight to the advisory board. My role expanded not in title, but in influence. Decisions carried more deliberation. Younger associates began asking about long-term planning rather than short-term optics. I noticed that laughter in the hallways now followed insight rather than dismissal. Respect had become routine rather than exceptional. One afternoon, as I prepared to leave, I paused by the large window overlooking the river. The water moved steadily beneath the bridge, unaffected by conversation, unaffected by recognition. Consistency carries its own authority. My phone vibrated with a brief message from Diane. "Thank you for coming to dinner," it read. No embellishment. No defense. I responded simply, "Of course." That was enough. Brandon's provisional status converted to formal promotion by the end of the fiscal year. He accepted it with measured gratitude, acknowledging the guidance he had received without dramatizing it. He no longer sought to prove himself through volume. He proved himself through preparation. As for me, my days remained structured, deliberate, steady. The word that once echoed in a brightly lit living room had dissolved entirely, replaced not by retaliation, but by recalibration. I did not confront it. I outlasted it. Influence, when carried quietly, reshapes perception without spectacle. I have never needed to announce my value. It reveals itself in time, in discipline, in the long arc of stability that does not bend for laughter. And that has always been enough.